terms of basing my minis, I like to go all out. This can lead to some problems, especially time. It can take me as long to build a really cool base as it does for me to actually paint the model, and that is not super efficient. One possible solution to this is buying custom bases that already come looking really cool, but this can lead to its own problems. Number one, price, but number two, like how perfectly does it match your minis? How much available base is there to glue your model's feetsies to? And how easy it is to edit, especially if they're 3D printed out of that like really hard brittle resin. It can be really hard to get exactly what you're looking for. Also, availability. Are they gonna have every single size available? Are they gonna have 35 by 60 oval bases for the one time you need one of those? Probably not. The solution I have come to and I've been tinkering with all year is custom resin casted bases. And it's actually not that tricky. I made it my goal this year to get a 2,000 point Dark Eldar army finished, and I always want my armies to be different so I don't get bored and so I get to try new things, and for my elves, I decided to really go for the basing. No cork and texture paste under these fellas, they all have resin rocks under their feet. So far I've made 28.5mm bases for the little guys, 40mm for the grotesques, and 60mm bases for the vehicles. I've been using smooth on silicone for my molds and Illumilite resin for the casts, and it's been working really well. My first few casts were done in February and they've held up perfectly with no problems. My molds have also held up just fine and I've been casting with these suckers all year. The trickiest part has actually been sculpting the bases. I've been using slate rock. I bought some decorative slate in small and medium sizes and milliput to get it all together and smooth. I've made it pretty far in my Dark Eldar journey with 28.5, 60s, and 40mm bases, but now that my army is nearing completion, I really need some 32s. And I need two different versions of 32mm bases. I need taller, more overgrown ones that can accept flying stand bases for Hellions and Reaver jet bikes, and I need flatter ones for all of the characters to stand on. So, I gotta build them. Another thing I'm trying out on my Drukhari is no base rims. Instead, I use these magnet stickers that come in the sizes I need for my bases. I build everything on top of these, and once they're cast up, I can stick them underneath. I rubbed these down with some sandpaper to add a little bit of grit and got to work. To get the rocks posed exactly how I want, I've been using milliput, squishing my rocks into position and waiting for them to dry, but I want to try a new trick. I took small balls of paper towel, soaked them in ultra-thin superglue, and squished my rocks into them. This works great and got the rocks held firmly almost instantly. I don't know if this is a great solution for long term, but really I only need these to exist today. If they fall apart down the road, it's no big deal. In addition to the paper towel, I also sprinkled on some baking soda over the superglue. This activates the superglue and makes it set instantly. Once I got my bases loaded up with plenty of rocks and making sure to leave enough flat space for feet to go, I used my airbrush to blow off any extra baking soda and got to work finishing these bases. I mixed up some milliput and got to work squishing this into all the nooks and crannies. One thing that doesn't work well for casting is sharp overhangs, so I built up the points a lot using milliput to make them good and chonky. One tool I found perfect for this are these sculpting sticks that end in little metal balls. I dip the tip in water so the milliput doesn't stick, and then I can push around the milliput. The ball helps me squish the putty down so I can poke and prod the putty until it's the shape I want and I can get rid of the excess. The rock and milliput are non-porous, which is perfect for casting. I haven't experimented much with sand and cork. I bet they would work, but would probably benefit from a few heavy coats of paint to make them a little bit more watertight. Now that I have most of my bases covered, I use some Tamiya putty to get the gritty, jagged rock texture over the milliput to make it look like some of the rocks are bigger and smoother than they really are. Then to fill in the gaps, I took some crushed slate rock and sprinkled it over the bases, letting them fall naturally into the low spots and cracks, and then lock them down with a few drops of ultra-thin superglue. Then for the surrounding base, I used Elmer's glue to sprinkle on some sand. Since the angles are pretty steep, it's hard to get the sand to sit just right with superglue, so Elmer's glue helps it stick. Now, a thing to keep in mind with casting is you get out exactly what you put in. So I could have made this project really easy on myself and casted one base, but it would have looked pretty silly to have half of my Drukhari army standing on literally the exact same rock with 3 little points sticking out the front and another one sticking off to the left. I've decided to go with 6, which I think will give me enough variety if I mix and match to make every base look a little bit unique. Now, if you wanted to make bases that were a little bit more like hard edge industrial, which would be a really good use case for casting bases, it might be a little trickier still, because you could end up with situations where like, hey, how come every 5th guy is standing on a base with a sewer grate and a light bulb nearby? Maybe in that scenario, you take the sewer grate and the light bulb, and you either leave them until the models are done, or you cast those up separately as bits, and then you get your kind of blank bases, and then you put those bits on at the end to give you even more variety. And speaking of more variety, I need to add just a little bit more variety to these bases. What would be the perfect thing to make a Dark Elder planet look more sinister? Skulls. I grabbed my Citadel skull sprue and got to work. Because I'm casting these, I filled in each eye hole with milliput. If I knew more about casting and had a pressure pot and some really nice equipment, I could probably get these skulls to cast perfectly, but I'm pretty amateur, so every little bit helps. I superglued my skulls down onto the base, and to help set them into the environment and to help them cast a little bit better, I filled up the spaces surrounding the skulls a little. I took some texture paste and scooped this all around the skulls so that there was some physical stuff surrounding them. As long as these stick out skulls are a little more gradual, they should cast much better, and there's no risk of silicone getting underneath and trapping the skulls in my mold. I've got my 6 bases as good as I can make them, and it is time to replicate them. I'm gonna be using a Moldstar 16 Fast, which is fantastic. It really does cure in half an hour, and it gives you a really nice silicone mold. However, a word of warning on smooth-on silicones, I found they have a really bad shelf life. If you end up buying a product like this, I would open them up as soon as you get them, like open up the jars and double check that they haven't already gone bad and you need to return them, and you gotta use it up in a timely manner. I actually bought this a month ago and I'm already starting to get a little nervous, so time to cast. This stuff pours in a 1-to-1 ratio, so I need to make a little box to go around my bases. And I want the box as small as possible so I don't use any more silicone than I have to. I started out cutting a little foam core board exactly big enough for my bases to sit on, and then a 1/2 inch all around them. If the silicone walls are too small, the mold can tear and fall apart, but if they're too big, it's just a waste of expensive silicone. In my previous experiments, I took foam core and carefully cut slits running down the length to get a perfectly bendy strip. This was a huge waste of time. I have a new solution, cardboard. I put packing tape over one side to make it extra watertight and then stepped on it, crushing it flat so it bends easily. Then I peeled the tape off my stickers and stuck down the bases. If you aren't using stickers, you can glue down the bases with Elmer's glue, just make sure you let them dry completely so the bases don't shift under the weight of the silicone. I used hot glue to glue the walls around my bases. Hot glue is perfect for this because it's rubber, so seeing the glue squish and beat up lets me see that there's no holes around the edges for the silicone to leak through. I made myself a mark about a 1/2 inch above the highest point on the base, and now to measure exactly how much volume I need to replace with silicone, I poured in some sand. I found this stuff, it's decorative sand painted gold, and this works really well, not because it's painted gold, but because the grain sands are pretty big, so they don't get trapped in corners and details. Once I filled it up to my fill line, I poured this into a sacrificial cup, making a line right where the sand ends. Then I got rid of the sand and replaced it with water, placing it on my kitchen scale. Now I know 3.4 ounces is exactly how much silicone I need to perfectly fill this mold. The silicone I'm using needs 50% A and 50% B, so I need 1.7 ounces from each bottle. I poured in my silicone. This stuff is pretty thick, so it was tricky to pour it exactly. I ended up going a little bit over, but a little over is okay. Looking at the instructions for the silicone, the work time is 6 minutes. That's how long the silicone will be liquid and pourable, so I have to mix the two halves together and get them into the mold in that amount of time, which is fast. The silicone is really expensive, and the only way to mess it up really is to not stir it enough. So to make sure that it's good and stirred, I made this. 2 popsicle sticks super glued to a grill match. I can stick this into my drill and it'll do the stirring for me faster and better than I could do it myself. I set a stopwatch so I can see how long I'm working and then pour the two halves together, giving it 3 minutes of stirring and 3 minutes of pouring. The super stirring introduced a lot of bubbles, but pouring from really high up pops all those bubbles as the silicone pours down in a long thin stream. I slowly let it fill up the mold and then left it alone for 30 minutes. That was so much fun, I did it twice. And there is a method to my madness. Because I had 3 short bases and 3 tall bases, my logic for pouring was I wanted a 1/4 inch of more silicone than the highest point of the base, so I was able to save like a whole ounce of silicone. And speaking of silicone, these puppies are dry, it's been half an hour, and I want to see how they turned out. Demolding is like Christmas morning, tearing apart the cardboard so I can see how these turned out. It looks perfect. My bases pulled out nicely, and just looking at the molds, they look really good. I can perfectly see the little face of the skull, but I won't really know until I try them out. I also see some sand got left behind. I used to try to pull these out with tweezers, but I found that all of these little slate bits will get pulled out on the first cast. One thing I did to the molds is I used some scissors to cut off the edges. For casting, I need these to sit flat on my desk, so I need to cut off where the silicone crept up the sides of the cardboard. And you know what else creeps up from the sides? That's right, EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch like our new Nick and Jay dice and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. For the month of October, we've been expanding on our orc terrain with the Orc Rocket Factory. Fill your game boards with ramshackle walls and a grisly gate with an explosive flare. Man the battlements of an orc's weapon workshop absolutely dripping with bombs, rockets, and pointy missiles. This modular terrain is fully compatible with our previous orc brewery in the Octeris terrain and can be assembled in all sorts of shapes ready to detonate at a moment's notice. I still have my original bases. It's not really important to keep the originals, but I like to have them. If these molds ever break, I could remake them, and I could even add more rocks and skulls and get a whole new base out of these. I took my Alumilite casting resin and got to work mixing the two halves together and pouring them into the bases, using a disposable paintbrush to poke the resin into the points of the bases. This resin works fast, with a 2 to 3 minute work time. I did 1 minute of stirring and 1 minute of pouring, and this stuff gets super hot. A slower curing resin would be gentler on the silicone and probably lead to getting more casts out of them. Probably a good idea for characters or bits, but these natural bases, I don't mind only getting 10 or 20 casts out of them. I also mixed in some Alumilite Black. The resin cures white naturally, but I want them to cure black so that if I accidentally chip the bases, it won't be as noticeable under my dark paint jobs. After 10 minutes, I did my first pull. I didn't mix in quite enough black, so they're actually really gray, but they look really good. I immediately filled the molds back up and did a second pull. This is the magic of casting. I spent the whole morning building 6 bases, but now I can have 6 bases every 10 minutes. When I'm pouring, I poured any excess resin into my other molds. This sinks into the points and gives me more fodder for decorating my bases and making more molds down the road. There were a couple of little errors I found. I got a few bubbles in the silicone, which leads to little bubbles of resin in the final results, but that's super easy to clean off with a quick swipe of my hobby knife. All in all, the bases are just about perfect. Boom! 40 custom bases done. I got 2 molds done, 40 bases. This is gonna be enough for pretty much the rest of my Drukhari army, at least all of the infantry. I would say even though it's pretty custom and a fair bit of work, it's pretty darn efficient. I mean, 40 bases and making the molds 1 day. I would love to be able to know, like, how long does it take to base models? To glue on the cork and put on the texture paste and sink little skulls everywhere? Also, hilariously with the skulls, I used up 7 skulls, but it turned into like 30 skulls once I casted it, and it's technically a recast. I recasted Games Workshop models, and we all know how much Games Workshop loves to sue people. I am really loving custom casted bases for my Dark Eldar army. It makes them super unique amongst my collection, and it would have been like impossible to make these interesting rock formations across the entire army, because it takes me like an hour to make each base. But that's not so bad when that 1 hour turns into 7 bases across my army. With 32mm bases added to my Dark Eldar project, I can now get to work on my Scourges, which are probably the most pressing project on the workbench, especially if I want to beat Scott the Miniature Maniac this December. Since the beginning of this year, Scott and I have been working in tandem on separate Dark Eldar armies, and in December, we're gonna make them battle. And speaking of battles, I recently won an eBay battle, an auction for an original Court of the Archon, which is a super spicy, amazing unit for the Dark Eldar that Games Workshop hasn't sold in like 2 years. I don't know why, but Games Workshop will not make Dark Eldar miniatures. But whenever they do, I'll be ready to make bases for them. Thanks for watching.